Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen, and my guest in episode 39 is Sarah Elks. During her decade of writing for The Australian, Sarah has reported on many of the biggest news stories that have taken place in Queensland. It takes tenacity and passion to be a daily news reporter, and Sarah clearly has an abundance of both of these qualities. After extensively covering the fallout from the closure of the Queensland Nickel refinery in late 2015, Sarah was named Journalist of the Year at the Queensland Clarion Awards for her stories that uncovered Clive Palmer's use of the alias Terry Smith to manage his business while also holding office as a Member of Parliament. The judges for that award in 2016 noted that Sarah's work is, quote, a tremendous how-to for journalists young and old and deserves recognition, end quote. I met with Sarah at her home in Brisbane's inner north in early July to record a conversation which touches on how she manages an unpredictable workload that can vary drastically from week to week, how she handled the paranoia of correspondent syndrome while working as the Australian's sole reporter based in far north Queensland, how her 2 years in that role took her to a remote island in the Torres Strait where few people will ever have the privilege of setting foot, why she has a deep and abiding passion for court reporting, which is not shared by many other journalists, and how she increases her likelihood of getting Clive Palmer to respond to her text messages during the course of reporting on the man himself. Introducing Sarah Elks, Queensland political reporter at The Australian. Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're talking on your day off in your home. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
I was going back through your reporting in the last week, and in the last 7 days you've reported on police complaints against Pauline Hanson, political donations to the Ipswich Mayor, Queensland tourism and boxing, the Dreamworld incident of last year, and Clive Palmer lawsuits, among other subjects. That's not an exhaustive list. I'm curious to know, how do you juggle all those different topics within a week?
Probably poorly. No, I think it's just every day. You start every day afresh, and every day is a new day to stuff up, as one of my colleagues says.
Which colleague?
He might remain nameless because
sure.
He says it in a. That's actually the G-rated version of how he says it.
This is an explicit podcast. You can say whatever you like.
He says every day is a new day to fuck up. So, if you've had a particularly bad day, that's supposed to be the cheery way to end the day. Which I'm not sure. I don't know if it has the desired effect, but I think with daily news reporting, it's kind of, you really do start most days afresh, and some days you go in and think, I don't know what I'm going to do today. Other days, it's a little bit more, I try and be a little bit more planned. And you asked, how do I keep all of those things, separate, or how do I juggle them? I don't really know. I think I just can do, maybe just you learn how to do several stories at once. Maybe might have to file 2 or 3 stories a day. So it's just a matter of, I guess, during the day doing the reporting, and that kind of becomes a jumbled sort of thing, and then at the end of the day sit down and write one story and then write the next story.
Right. Well, looking at that example of the last 7 days, for instance, how many of those roughly would have been things that just happened and you therefore reported on versus things that you were reporting ahead of time?
Well, the Dreamworld thing is something that I've been working on for a while. So I covered the tragedy when it happened in October last year, and for the last little while I've been wondering what was happening with that, and I've kind of kept in contact with a few of the different agencies to work out where they're at. So that one was something that I'd been working on for a while to try and get, I guess, a satisfactory response from I think it was the Workplace Health and Safety Department as to where they were at with the investigation.
So things have gone kind of quiet for a while.
Things have gone really quiet.
You reminded yourself that, hang on, people want to know some answers here.
Yeah.
Including the families in question, of course.
That's right. And your friend and mine, Trent Dalton, I asked him, could he put in a good word for me with the father of one of the people who died, which he did, and then gave me his phone number, and that provided the lead to the story, because it's not so interesting that the investigations are still ongoing without knowing, I guess, exactly what that impact is to the people to whom it matters the most, so the families of those victims. So, and with that one, I took the risk. I'd been working on it sort of for a couple of weeks or something, but only just 5 or 10 minutes here and there. And I kind of took the risk that I didn't need to roll it out as soon as I'd gotten all the material, because I figured nobody else was asking the same, no other journalist was asking the same questions, just by luck, I suppose. So I think, was that in the paper on Monday, maybe?
May have been.
I don't know.
And if not the weekend?
Yeah, it's terrible how you can't remember. It was only like 3 days ago. But I have a feeling that I put that up when I worked on Sunday for Monday's paper.
Yeah,
maybe.
right.
That was at least my intention, because sometimes you can get a better run in a Monday paper for things like that.
Do you have the control over what goes in the paper which day? And is the weekend edition kind of the place to get the most visibility for a story?
I think it's the weekend paper is the paper with the most readers. So yeah, sometimes if you've got something really big that you're working on, or if you've got a longer piece, then you might aim to get it in the weekend paper. But sometimes that's trickier because everything is worked out away in advance. So if it's a news of the day thing that breaks on a Thursday or Friday more likely, it's more difficult to get that in the weekend paper than something that you've sort of flagged. Like, we get asked for our Saturday ideas on a Tuesday, which I find really difficult to come up with something sometimes, unless there's something that I have on the go. It's just too early for me to start thinking about it. But we have control sort of over, I guess, when you ask for a certain story to be put on the news list in the morning. So I guess you've got a chance that that'll be in the paper the next day. But in the end, it's just up to the editors. And often, if they can't fit a story in a certain day's paper, they will hold it over, and then you watch it. It's up to them, I suppose, when they run it.
Do you always file to the same editor?
It goes through, so the conduit is our bureau chief, or he's called the Queensland editor now,
What's
Michael
his name?
McKenna. You should interview him for your podcast. He's got lots of good stories.
Noted.
So he's sort of our conduit between us in the Brisbane bureau and our overlords in Sydney. So the backbench, the paper's based in Sydney. So he's the person who we pitch our stories to in the morning, and then he puts them on the news list, our Brisbane news list, and then he pitches it to the Sydney National Chief of Staff, or the Sydney-based National Chief of Staff. And that same process happens in the afternoon, and we keep him up to date with our story the whole day. And the idea is then that people in Sydney aren't sort of having to chase up every individual reporter around the country. Sometimes, though, they do. Like if they've got a particular interest, or if they want to tell you a request from the editor out of conference, like, could you particularly look at this angle or that angle, or could you answer this question in the story? They might contact you directly, but pretty much it all goes through the bureau chief. Yeah.
How often do you come to those morning pitch meetings and say, I've got nothing?
Often when you come back from holidays, like I came back from overseas, just went on a holiday at the start of the year or between March and April, and I came back, and for about the first week or week and a half, I was like, I don't remember how to be a journalist. I don't remember how to find a story. I don't know what to do with my life. And then after a couple of weeks, then you start to almost get too many things to do. So there's still definitely days where you come in and go, I'm really hoping that something comes up. I hope news breaks during the day that I can then cover, because you feel a bit derelict in your duty if you don't have at least one story on the news list every morning. And if you don't, you better have a good you better say, well, it's because I'm working on this bigger piece for Saturday's paper, or I'm working on a daily feature for this editor, or this is what I'm doing, or whatever. You can't really, I don't know if it's probably self-imposed, but you can't really feel, there's no such thing as just like having a, I feel too guilty to just have a day where you're not really doing very much. Or if you're not pitching, you've got to have a good excuse. You've got to be doing something.
Well, you can't just sit there scrolling through news sites yourself, looking at the competition or seeing what else is out there. You've got to
sort of juggle that with other things. And don't get me wrong, there are like slower days and you use those days to ring your contacts, or sometimes there will be days where I try and maybe just do like a little story that's easy. I know I can turn around quickly and try and use those days to go and look at a court document that I've been waiting to look at, or go and have a coffee with a contact that I need to catch up with, or something like that. So sort of juggling take advantage of a slow day when you have it to get stuff done.
I'm a feature writer, as you know, and as you pointed out prior to this conversation, many of my guests on Penmanship have been of that sort of ilk. There has been a few like Amy Ramikis and Tony Moore at the Brisbane Times, who are more
Kiriakou as well.
Indeed,
yeah.
Career male journalist. I have the luxury of time as a feature writer. I can have slow days or even slow weeks where not a whole lot is happening, but you don't have that luxury. Do you find your job stressful at times, in the fact that you feel like you need to be doing something at all times?
Yeah, it is stressful. That just before you got here, I finished listening to your episode with Richard, whose surname I don't know how to pronounce because
Richard Gilliatt.
I only read it. I've never met him, and he said that he gets news reporters walking past his pod and saying rude things about the fact that they get 4 weeks to work on a story, and he was sort of really offended by that. And that made me laugh, because through the first half, and I love his work and I think he does an amazing job, and I've never written anything that's 4,000 words long, so absolutely no judgment. But up until that point, just going through my head, I was thinking, oh my God, I can't believe that you get to work on a story for 4 weeks. That is amazing. I wish I had more time sometimes to do things. But yeah, it's stressful. I don't know. I think all daily news journalists have to live on that certain kind of, like, it's a little bit of that adrenaline that keeps you going, and it's sort of sometimes difficult to switch off when you get home, because it's like that sort of frenetic pace of what's happening on Twitter, what's happening on the opposition's news sites, what's going on here. I've got to check my emails. It's because you've got at least a daily deadline for the paper, but then now in the world of the interwebs, you theoretically have as many deadlines as you want to give yourself, because now you're expected to file during the day as well if there's stuff happening. So
are there people in your life
stressful.
People in your life who tell you to switch off?
My husband. Yeah, my husband will text at a certain time in the evening to be like, "You coming home anytime soon? Do you think maybe you should leave work? Time to eat dinner?" And yeah, he's very good at sort of telling me to put my phone away and try and distract from all the, work stuff that's happening. But yeah.
How much of your job as a daily reporter is reactionary or reacting to what is happening in the world versus pursuing your long-term interests as a reporter? Are there stories that you've got to put aside because something massive has just happened in Queensland politics?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know what the percentage is. I think I heard you ask the same question to Amy in one of your early episodes, and I think I agree. I think she said 60-40, like 60% reactionary and 40% your own stories. And I think that's probably pretty accurate. We have a little bit of an advantage, I suppose, being at the Oz, in that I cover state politics, or that's my prescribed round, as well as a few other bits and pieces. And because it's a national paper, we can sometimes make the judgment call that I don't have to file on that particular thing that's happened in state politics, because I don't think that our national readers would be interested in it, or I just don't think it will get in the paper. So we sometimes have like a little bit of an advantage in that sense of being able to respectfully ignore certain stuff that just is not necessarily nationally appealing. So that sometimes gives me more of a chance to work on other stuff. But yeah, often putting aside in investigations or stories that, like at the moment, you asked me what those notes were. I've got a stack of papers next to me on the kitchen table with a whole heap of tips that readers have sent in to say, oh, could you have a look at this, or I think this is a story.
To you?
To me, yeah. And some of them are a few weeks old, and I haven't been able to get to them because either things have been breaking or there's been other work to do, and that's really frustrating for me and stressful for me, I suppose, because I feel like I owe those people a duty to at least be respectful enough to have a look into it and then get back to them and say yay or nay. A story that I did recently came out of a tip from a reader, and that took a few weeks to get up, and that person who contacted me had to be patient, or I had to encourage them to be patient, to bear with me that I was still really interested in the story, but I just needed the proper time to work on it. And that was about the Premier's new Chief of Staff, a guy called David Barbagallo, who had a long and colourful history in politics in Queensland and in business in Queensland, and somebody had written they called, I think, and they'd asked for me, or the person who I'd written an original story with, about this guy just being hired in the Premier's office, and he rang to say that we should look into what was happening with his previous job, which was a charity called Endeavour, the Endeavour Foundation, underpaying its workers, and a fair work investigation and all that kind of thing. And to his credit, all of that was accurate, and I managed to stand it up, but it did take a little bit of toing and froing, and there were times where this person said, are you sure the paper's interested in this story? Are you sure that you're interested in it? And I had to be like, yes, really interested, but I keep getting waylaid on other topics. And with that story, we had to hold the news story angle about it because my editor decided he wanted a feature about the life and times of this colourful Queensland character. So yeah, it all turned out in the end, but that was like a little bit of juggling between what my daily, the reactionary part of my job, and then the proactive trying to generate stories of my own, or stories that other people don't have. So I guess the proactive stuff sometimes has to just squeeze in around the news that's breaking that you just have to cover.
Yeah, you've got in your Twitter bio, I think, something like, got a tip? And your email address is there.
Yeah.
Is that where a lot of your reader tips come from? Twitter or email? Or?
I think people do email through from Twitter sometimes. People call the paper. People might just be looking for a reporter to unload on. So most of it comes through email. And as you know, I'm very bad at email. I'm really bad at it. And it's something that I wish I was better at managing I might get like I would get at least 100 emails a day, and most of them are complete rubbish, as in like press releases and that kind of thing. But it's a really difficult, it's just an overwhelming amount of information. So sometimes, unfortunately, like the important things slip through the cracks, and this is like a counselling session where I'm admitting all my bad habits, so I really need to be better at that.
That's what I'm here for. That's what the podcast is for. Sarah Elks Therapy Podcast.
I will be paying you for this psychoanalysis at the end of the session.
I am not qualified. Let me just point that out. That can be stressful in itself, though, having hundreds of emails sitting there, especially when they're from individual people who are contacting you because they value you and your reporting, and you know that, but you've got all these other things that you have to do to make tomorrow's paper. Does that add to your stress?
Yes, even you just saying that makes my chest tighten. Yeah, that does. It really does add to my stress. If it was just, it's the real people. This sounds ridiculous, but I think it's the that you have expectations. That you feel that I feel the responsibility of having to respond to just ordinary humans that might reach out, and I make that distinction as opposed to, say, politicians or political staffers or people in the media. It's sort of okay if you sit on an email from like a media advisor trying to pitch you some silly thing. Sorry to all the media advisors who listen to this, but I find it less personally acceptable to have to wait for ages before I can properly address an email from somebody who's genuinely concerned about some issue in their life or some great injustice that they think has been done to them or whatever.
When you're reporting, I mean, you've been a reporter at The Australian for 10 years.
Yeah.
You recently celebrated your 10th anniversary.
Yes.
I believe.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
How has your role as a reporter changed during that time? Was email as much of a stress-inducing thing 10 years ago, for instance?
I don't think it wasn't, because I sound like such an old lady, because when I first started in journalism in 2007, when I was just unnecessarily aging myself. In 2007, when I first got my job at The Australian, I don't think from memory, I don't know whether I had a smartphone, or I certainly couldn't get my email on the phone, and I didn't have the capacity to Google things on the run. So I remember, like, when I was an intern in Sydney at The Australian, and they just send you on the most random jobs because you're often on the night shift, and if things happen, like, I remember having to go and be at a doorstop with Sophia Loren, the beautiful legendary Italian film star, out in the western suburbs of Sydney. And I remember being in a taxi on the way, ringing my mum and being like, can you please look on the internet for anything that you can find out about Sophia Loren? And then just, because I didn't really know anything about her. And suppose quickly like writing down facts in the taxi on the way. And yeah, obviously that's changed hugely. I no longer have to ring my mother to do my research for me.
Unpaid research assistant.
Yeah, that's right. I was also unpaid at that time, so we were both being unpaid together. But yeah, so that's changed hugely, and I guess I still worked really long hours back then, but to a certain extent, you left, or certainly more so than now, you left your work at work because you couldn't check your email on your phone. Yeah. Ugh. Those are the glory days. I imagine it would be like when you talk to reporters who have been doing this for a really, really long time, and when they started, there was no mobile phones, and they would have to ring in on jobs from like a payphone or something, or
dictate over the phone, call copy.
Yeah, well, that was still happening when I started. There was still like one or two copy takers in the Sydney office, so people would ring in and dictate copy.
Wow. Which
just, I mean, it seems like a completely different universe, which I suppose it sort of was, even in the last 10 years.
It can't be there anymore, can they? Those two copy takers?
No.
Because everyone can type the little draft on their phone and send it in.
Exactly.
Do you do that often? Do you report from your phone, as in write drafts and flick it onto your editor, or is it always at a laptop?
Both. It depends how quickly you need to file. So sometimes if I just want to file like a couple of like really quick snap pars or something to the website, I'll just type them as an email on my phone. And if it's something a bit longer, like if I'm filing from Parliament all day or something, I'll do it on the laptop. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, how did you come to journalism in the first place? What was the attraction?
When I think I decided that I wanted to be a journalist when I was about 15, and I decided that I wanted to be the editor of Rolling Stone, as you do, because and I wanted to write about music, and that's what I wanted to do. I don't think I really realised then that and as an editor you don't get to write all that much. You know, you don't write the stories yourself. I was just like, what's the most important job in music journalism? And then I want to do that. And then it wasn't until, so I studied journalism at uni, and it wasn't really until my final year of journalism when I had my first taste of being in a newsroom, and we did an internship subject, and I got to go to the Queensland Times out at Ipswich for, I think I was there for 2 weeks. And like on one of my first days, I got to write a story that ended up being on the front page of the Queensland Times, which seems ridiculous now, but I mean, they were short-staffed even then, so I think they were just happy to have somebody there, an extra body there.
What was the story?
I think it was something to do with the dangers of smoking while pregnant, I think. And I remember I had to go into the Ipswich Mall and find people who were either pregnant and were smoking, or were pushing prams with babies and were smoking. There were surprisingly a lot of people who were doing that. And it was something, it was a story, something like that. And I remember wasn't just having the story be on the front page, which was very exciting, but it was just like the general newsroom vibe and the excitement of daily news. And I remember even just like loving the commute from Brisbane to Ipswich, listening to the news on the radio on the way in and getting excited, and then doing the same thing on the way home. And yeah, I think from that moment I was like, I just want to do just the news, thanks. I just want to write in newspapers.
Rolling Stone can wait. Daily News is for me.
Yeah, because I was definitely destined to be the editor of Rolling Stone, for sure. Yeah. Until I got seduced by the Queensland Times at Ipswich.
I'm glad you remember that story. First cover story is an important step. How did you introduce yourself during those Vox Pops in the Ipswich Mall? Do you remember?
Oh, I can't remember.
Were you up to the task, or were you...
I think it was I think I would have found it really terrifying. I still find it scary approaching people out of the blue, and even depending on who the person is, ringing people out of the blue sometimes is like a little bit unnerving. I mean, it's fine because you have to do it 20 times a day, but there's still a little bit of anxiety. Even if, like yesterday, I'm trying to find an ex-Queensland Nickel worker to be in a picture story for, I think it'll be Monday's paper. And there are a few people, like I've got 2 pages in my contact book full of people who used to work for Queensland Nickel. And I even felt nervous ringing people 18 months on, because I was like, you probably don't want to talk about this. Like, you probably don't want someone ringing out of the blue saying, hey, remember how you had the traumatic experience where you got sacked by Clive Palmer? Would you like to talk about it again? And could we also take your photograph? And but yeah, I found a really lovely guy who I met at the time, who has said yes to it, and he's wonderful, and I've interviewed him, and he's going to be in a photograph and all that kind of thing. So it all turned out well, but there was still the nerves before a couple of those phone calls where I just thought, I'm probably going to disturb your day, and I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. Yeah, everyone's very polite, and I'm polite when I ring, but yeah, it's still a little bit like, it's like that intrusion on people's lives.
I think there might be something wrong if you didn't have those nerves and didn't have those feelings about intruding. If you just thought you should call anyone and they should talk to you, that's a very different way of thinking about journalism. You must talk to me because I am Sarah Elks at the Australian.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I just assume that nobody wants to talk to the media, and that why would you? In a lot of cases, why would you? I mean, it's easy. A lot of cases, it's easier not to.
Why do people talk to journalists then? Why do people talk to you, Sarah?
I don't know. Like I think that's why I tried to avoid talking to you for so long, because I think a lot of people think that they've got interesting things to say, so that helps. I think some people feel. I mean, politicians talk to the newspapers because they have to, because they want to sell their message, because they want to get their message to voters. But ordinary people talk to the newspapers sometimes because we ask them nicely, and sometimes because we want to listen to what they have to say, and maybe they feel like people haven't really listened to them properly before.
And they want to be heard.
Yeah. And it gives them a chance to tell their story. I'm still baffled sometimes when people say yes to talking, particularly when every year we do budget. We obviously cover the budget, the federal budget and the state budget. And a key part of that process is finding case studies ahead of time to illustrate the impact of whatever the budget measures are. And thankfully I didn't have to find any this year, but in the past I've had to find several each year, and it gets to the point where you need to get them to disclose almost everything about themselves: their full name, their children's names, their ages, what their occupation is, what their husband or wife's occupation is, what their earning bracket is, what middle class welfare measures they might receive, all of this personal information, and every time I find somebody who says, and you know, you're so grateful when someone says, sure, I'll do that, but I think like it's an incredible leap of faith to entrust all that information to a journalist and to a paper, and then have it out there in the world. So I think, you know, our responsibility is to the best of our ability, try and represent their stories as honestly and as accurately as possible, because those details are so, you know, they're so important and precious to them that, yeah, every time a mistake appears, because mistakes do appear, it's just the worst. It's the worst feeling, and you have to ring. Like, I always try and, if it happens that a mistake creeps through, I always try and ring the person immediately and apologise. And yeah, it's not very fun. Not that it happens like a whole heap, but when it does happen, it's horrifying.
How do you find those budget case studies? I've never considered that, but I mean, to give an example from previous years,
okay.
Like, I don't know, welfare has been reduced by X amount per week.
Yeah. I
don't know. Like,
well, the most recent one that I had to do, I had to try and find a middle income family, and their income had to be between a certain bracket. They had to have a child in childcare. They had to potentially have another baby on the way because it was something to do with, I can't even remember now. And at that stage, it was quite soon before the budget, and I just had no idea how to go about it because it's so specific. I think they also needed to be in a marginal electorate.
Right.
So in the end, I think I was working on a few different stories at the time. So I just asked every single person that I interviewed, do you know anyone like this? Do you know anyone who would fall into this category? And in the end, I was writing stories about vegetation management, which is like tree clearing laws in Queensland. It's a big political issue last year.
Queensland has the highest rates in Australia, I believe.
Yes, I
Almost
think so.
One of the highest in the world.
Well, we have, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
But Brazil's worse, and that's about it.
Yeah.
I think I read your story about this, maybe. I don't know. I can't remember.
Maybe. And I've ended up finding somebody who's in the office of AgForce, the farm lobby. So, lovely woman who worked in the office. I asked the media person, is there anyone in your office who fits this bill? And they came up with this lady, and she was lovely, and her husband and their little boy, and they were about to have another baby. And we went and took their photograph on a Sunday and interviewed them and got all of their uncomfortable details and took up 3 hours of their Sunday morning. And here's the fun bit about newspapers. It never ran. They went with a different middle income family from the other side of the country.
Oh my God.
And I had pulled so many strings and asked for so many favors and pleaded with these poor people to be in the story. She was 9 months pregnant and she'd broken her ankle. That's right. So she was hugely pregnant and had a cast on her ankle, and we just wasted their time. So I sent them flowers to say thank you, and I'm really sorry that it didn't appear, because sometimes you just can't. Yeah, you can't.
You're not making that call.
I'm not making that call.
Yeah.
If it were up to me, they would have been the main story. I thought that they were perfect. They fit every single one of those categories. It's just down to the whim of the editor. So rough.
That's a good example. That's a shocker.
A bunch of picture stories.
When you found out, your heart must have just sunk.
It was terrible. The worst bit was, as well as wasting their time, but was finding out that they had commissioned them all around the country. That's the tricky thing about a national paper, is sometimes you won't know if they've... I guess it's like an insurance policy. There was nothing. I couldn't promise that I would get the perfect family.
So they asked all the state chiefs of staff.
Yeah, they asked at
editors.
least 2 other bureaus, I think, to find one just in case, because that was going to be the main picture story for the budget.
And you did it, and you got it.
I got
and
it.
that was
Yeah. Without telling the individual reporters, I suppose, that other people were also looking.
That other family is more photogenic, or who even knows?
I don't even know. These were very I thought they were perfect. They were a very photogenic family. So sometimes it's just I don't know. You have to ask my editors why that still hurts.
Yeah, that's sorry I brought it up.
No, I tried to send some. I sent them flowers just because I was just like, you gave up so much of your time and were so lovely. Anyway, yeah.
So you studied journalism at university, had an internship at Queensland Times. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And where did you study journalism?
At UQ. I did journalism and arts, and I majored in political science and Spanish at UQ. And in my final year, I did an internship at the QT, and I think I did maybe a week in the Courier Mail's sports section, just because I wanted to try and build up my portfolio as much as possible, get as much published as I could. I think I also wrote stories for the local paper at home, which I'm from the Sunshine Coast. I didn't write for the Sunshine Coast Daily. I wrote for the Budrum Chronicle, which is like a free newspaper that they give out. I think it's delivered as well in that suburb of the Sunshine Coast, just so that I could have stories in my portfolio when I went for my first job. And actually, after my internship with the Queensland Times, which I think went for 2 weeks, I asked the editor, would it be okay if I came back 1 day a week and just worked for free, because I wanted to try and get stories in my portfolio, get stories published, and I really liked it. So I think in my final year of uni, I was going to the Queensland Times once a week. I think I was working as a legal secretary 2 days a week, and I was doing uni 2 days a week because you don't have very many contact hours at university if you're studying journalism or arts. So yeah, I was trying to cram everything in that final year, because they tell you is it's really hard to get a job as a journalist, and you've got to really want it, and got to put yourself out there, and you've got to work for free, and you've got to get stories in the whatever paper you can. So I took that to heart, and that's what I was doing in my final year.
Do you think your Bachelor of Journalism equipped you for what the role entails?
No.
Why not?
Not to be critical of UQ, I'm not sure that I don't know whether any university course could equip you for what it's like to actually work in a newsroom. That final internship subject was really good because that was hands-on experience. But in previous subjects, like we did a news reporting subject, I think I had to write 4 stories in a term, and that's not realistic. Like 4 news stories, so 4 500-word stories, which I might write now, or even on the first day that you go in and work for a newspaper, you might be expected to do that in 1 day. So it doesn't really prepare you. Obviously the theory's good, and you need to know the legal side of things, and that was really useful. But no, I don't think it prepares you for the real world. I wish that they had taught us shorthand. That would have been great.
Did you since learn shorthand?
I've got sort of half shorthand, half scribble that I do. When I got my cadetship at the Australian, part of the deal was that you wouldn't be graded until you got to 100 words per minute. so you wouldn't be like a slightly better paid, really badly paid baby journalist until you got to 100 words per minute. And I think I went on leave after my first year of being a cadet, and I came back and I was graded. And my shorthand is workable and useful, but I look at the people who have beautiful, perfect 150 word per minute shorthand, and I just marvel at them. It's just such a useful skill to have.
Yeah, I don't have it, and it's like a magic power.
Yes, it is. It's like a superpower.
Yeah.
Shorthand girl. The nerdiest superhero ever.
So how did you come to the Australian then? You applied for a cadetship and you got it?
I moved to Sydney because my boyfriend at the time, now my husband, was working down there, and I thought that there would be more journalism opportunities in Sydney. And at that time, I think after I left uni, I was basically asking every person I knew, do you know anybody in the media? And my uncle knew somebody who had a history in newspapers, and I met him and showed him my portfolio, and he was impressed with, I suppose, the fact that by that stage I had like a stack of stuff that had been published. And he rang the editorial training person at the Australian, and that allowed me to get an interview for an internship, and I did a 6-week unpaid internship in the Sydney bureau of the Australian, and at the end of that I basically begged for a cadetship, and thankfully the begging worked, and it was right before the GFC, and just after they put me on and a few other people on, they went into a bit of a hiring freeze, so I think I got in just at the right time, and so I started as a cadet down there.
Must have been exciting. National broadsheet.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. It was amazing. I'd always sort of... my parents got like 3 papers every day, and I'd always sort of looked at the Australian as a really good paper. I admired the kind of like particularly Indigenous affairs coverage and that kind of thing. So I was just pinching myself. I was prepared to go anywhere and work in any newspaper. So to get my first job to be at the Australian I was thrilled and terrified at the same time, I think. Yeah.
What kinds of rounds or jobs were you given in those early days at the paper?
I was just doing general, so it was like anything from going doorstop Sophia Loren in Western Sydney to one day I got sent to Bondi Beach because there had been an earthquake somewhere and there was a tidal wave warning. So they were like, can you just go to Bondi and be there in case the tidal wave happens? So all these people were like rushing away from the beach, and here's me trundling up, just waiting for the natural disaster to occur. I don't know if that's very good workplace health and safety. It didn't, by the way. Spoiler alert. There was no tidal wave. So it was everything from like court cases to like some just minor court to a lot of picture stories, and sort of light, bright, fun stuff. It was really exciting. A lot of night shifts where they have one late reporter there just in case anything breaks. So I think there was occasions where this is terrible that I can't remember what the specific tragedy was, but I remember there was a particular multiple fatality type tragedy. I think it was a train crash or something. It's terrible that I can't remember. But one of my jobs was to, because I was on the late shift, try and find out as much as I could, try and find families of the victims and that kind of thing. So that was all very exciting. And then after about, I think, 3 months of me being an actual paid employee, so by that stage I'd been in the Sydney Bureau for maybe 6 months altogether, the editor-in-chief called me in and said, "You're a Queenslander, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yes." And he was also a Queenslander. And he said, "Well, we've got a spot in our Queensland Bureau. You speak the language, so you better go back there. We want you to go to Brisbane," which was very exciting because I'm from here, and I eventually wanted to come back because all my family's up here.
Was it Chris Mitchell?
It was Chris Mitchell, yeah. I think that was like one of the only times he interviewed me after I'd been an intern and when I was in the beating stage, I think, for my cadetship.
Yeah.
And then he told me that I was to go to Queensland, and I think they were like maybe 2 times that I spoke to him directly. I don't think the editor-in-chief talks to the baby journalist. That's not really the way things happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you came back to Queensland, and you were based at Bowen Hill's office, where
Yes.
you are today as well.
Although we were in the garage at that stage.
Really?
It was before the renovation of the building, and we were in this like hideous building that was sort of in the garage where the ceiling was falling in, and the carpet was decades old. And I remember when they were sending me back up from Sydney, they said, "Oh, look, it's very male dominated. They're in a garage. There's hardly any women in the office. It's very rough. Don't eat anything from the cafeteria." And I remember just picturing it as being like a mechanics with sort of, naked women calendars on the walls and that kind of thing. And obviously it was not like that at all. It was a newspaper office, and there were more men who worked there than women, but it was like the way they described it was sort of this kind of dystopian, terrifying place, and it wasn't like that at all. It's very welcoming.
Mm-hmm. And what rounds were you doing when you came back to Queensland? General or
general,
news reporting
with a fair bit of court stuff,
right?
Which was really good. Yeah.
We'll come to court reporting later. You were a North Queensland correspondent for the paper for 2 years, 2010 to 2012. How did that happen, and why did you like that role?
Yes, I was, and that was fantastic. They asked me to go to Cairns. We have on and off had the paper has had a North Queensland reporter on and off for a couple of decades. We don't at the moment. And they asked me to go, and I said yes. It was an amazing opportunity, also a little bit terrifying because I was to be in a sole person bureau basically, and my patch was to be from like Gladstone out to which you might note is not in North Queensland, out to the Northern Territory border and up to Papua New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
So that was enormous. That was my patch.
Beat.
That was my beat. Yeah, that was my route, which is just obviously impossible to sort of cover every single thing.
Yeah. And you were there by yourself. Were you in another office, like another News Corp office? Or
No. There's obviously the Cairns Post up there, which is a News Corp paper, and there was some talk about maybe I would just take a desk in there, but in the end, they ended up renting this little office space above the Nando's in the main street of Cairns. So I used to just like smell chips all day, every day, chips are a real problem for me. I was lucky enough to be next to, and I think this is why we picked the office space, but next to the journalist from AAP, who at the time was Evan Schwarten and later became Pat Caruana. So that was great to have another person, like a bit of camaraderie, because it's incredibly lonely and paranoia inducing to be a single person, like to be what they call a correspondent, I suppose, but obviously you're normally a correspondent if you're overseas, but the distance was so great, and because you only talk to your editor or your bureau chief in that case on the phone, it can be really lonely and really people had warned me about like correspondence syndrome, which is the way that I took it was just paranoia, in that you would go maybe several days or a week or something, sometimes pitching things and not being able to get anything in the paper and thinking, I'm doing a terrible job. Why am I here? What am I doing? I'm never going to get a story again. And then to times where it would be so busy that you wouldn't have time to think, where you might have stories on the front page, you know, most days out of a week. So it was very up and down. And the start of that was like a very, really shook my confidence a lot. Yeah, so I went from feeling like I knew what I was doing in Brisbane to thinking that I had no idea what I was doing in Cairns, and it took me a little while to find my feet. Yeah.
Do you remember what the longest period was between having stories in the paper?
Oh, it probably would have been like maybe not even a week.
Okay.
Yeah. but it just is like...
as a daily reporter,
that feels awful. And
so were you filing stories that they just weren't getting in, or
yeah,
right,
and sometimes it would be like was a tricky thing to work out what they might be interested in, like what was too local and what was too, normally it was what was too local, what would work in a national sense from North Queensland, I suppose. Yeah, so that was...
What did you find? What did work?
Well, what was really useful is if something had a great picture to go with it. So a lot of our readers are in Sydney and Melbourne, particularly in the winter months. There's nothing they like more than a picture about, like a picture story or a story that has a beautiful picture to go with it, something from tropical North Queensland. So at the time, I was up there for a Cyclone Yasi. So in the aftermath of that, I did lots of stories about people buying and selling islands and the, I guess, the rebuilding of island infrastructure after the cyclone. And those stories pretty much always got on the front page of the paper, because what's more beautiful than... I mean, even if an island's been hit by a cyclone, it's still gorgeous blue water and palm trees. And the other thing that Chris Mitchell did before he left the paper was he had a really strong commitment to Indigenous affairs coverage. So we did a lot of that up there, which was always... that was a lot of what I did in Cairns and the surrounds. And that always got a good run, which was good.
But there was no dedicated photographer there, so how did they arrange pictures for those stories?
There's a freelancer up there called Brian Cassie, who we did a lot of work with. Occasionally we might use the Cairns Post, photographs from the Cairns Post. I think even then there was a sharing arrangement with News Corp papers, but the majority of the stories I went on with Brian, or occasionally there would be, or I'd go to Townsville. We've got another amazing freelancer there called Cameron Laird. I'd work with him a lot, and occasionally they'd send up a photographer from Brisbane if that would work better with a story. For example, Lyndon Mickelson, who's our brilliant photographer in Brisbane, he had to come up one day for a couple of days because one of the editors at the time wanted to work out what the wettest place in Australia was, and where is the wettest place in Australia, and who is the person who reads the rain gauge at the wettest place in Australia. And when I got assigned that story, I was like, I won't say who it was. I was like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But in the end, like, full credit to that person who commissioned it, because turned out the wettest place in Australia was at the top of the second highest mountain in Queensland, which is called Bellenden Kerr, south of Cairns. You have to get there's like this industrial cable car that goes up the top there, because there's some form of, I can't remember now, some form of maybe like a telephone tower or some kind of industrial infrastructure up there. So there's this little man who gets into his cable car and goes up the top of the mountain and checks the rain gauge, and we did the story about him, and it was actually a cool story.
Yeah. And he gives that data to Bureau of Meteorology.
Yes, he gives that data to the Bureau of Meteorology, and it's the wettest place in Australia, and it was actually like a fun little story. So yes, I take it all back. It's very good. But yeah, Lyndon had been flown up for that one. So yeah, the key to getting good stories in the paper from a far-flung post is beautiful pictures. So it really had nothing to do with me.
This was a podcast about words.
Sorry.
It had a lot to do with you, so. You did some reporting from Torres Strait around that time, which I believe you particularly enjoyed.
Yes, that was a story that I did with Brian Cassidy, the photographer that I mentioned before, about Torres Strait secession from Queensland. I think there was a political angle. The Premier at the time, Anna Bligh, had written to the Prime Minister saying that she supported the idea of Torres Strait secession, so the idea of Torres Strait becoming a separate region, self-governing region from the rest of Queensland.
Kind of like Norfolk Island?
I believe so, yeah. The reason historically why it's never really gotten off the ground is, apart from, I guess, the financial problems, on how would the Torres Strait survive as its own entity, is they haven't been able to settle on a model. So anyway, so I'd written the news story, and then one of my bosses said, can we go up there and can we find somebody who was involved in the original push for the Torres Strait to become separate? And I did a lot of ringing around, and the consensus was that the father of the pioneer of the movement was this old man called George Mai, and he was on an island called Erub Island in the Torres Strait, and we had to fly to Horn Island, get a boat from, I can't really remember now what we did. I think we had to fly to Horn Island, got a boat to Thursday Island, got a boat back to Horn Island, flew in an even tinier plane all the way up that we had to charter all the way up to Erub Island, landed. It's like this tiny speck in the ocean, and walked to George's house where he's lived, like right on the beach, with his wife. They lived there for decades, and talked to him about his passion for the Torres Strait and for it becoming a separate region. And he sang us the song that he had written for when he addressed the United Nations, I think back in several decades before, when the movement was really getting going. Told us about his great friend Eddie Mabo, and yeah, it was just a spectacular privilege to go to a place that most people will never go to, and I got to go. It was like, obviously it was work because I had to write a story, but I got to talk to this incredibly interesting man and his wife and wander around this absolute paradise of an island, and I got paid to do it. So being up in North Queensland, even though it was really isolating and difficult at the start, was just full of experiences like that, getting to go to land handback ceremonies on Cape York, or going to Palm Island, or it was a huge privilege to do all of those things.
You left that role in June 2012. Is that because they stopped having that correspondent role, or you just wanted to come back to Brisbane?
It was a little bit of both. I think at the start, they tend to only have those. They tend to be about 2-year postings. So I loved it. I'd probably still be in Cairns if it would work in my personal life, because I made some of my best friends of my life up there, and the stories were so great. But it worked professionally and personally to come back to Brisbane. And after that, we've got a Northern Australia correspondent now who's Amos Aikman. He's based in Darwin, so the idea is that he does across the whole top of Australia. That was the original idea. Now he's so busy in the Northern Territory that we do most of... we basically do far North Queensland from Brisbane now. But yeah, I came back and pretty much went back to general reporting with a big focus on court stuff.
Court reporting.
Yeah.
You told me before this interview that you have a deep and abiding passion for it, which a lot of journalists don't necessarily share. What is it about court reporting that appeals to you?
I think I was quite lucky because in I think it must have been 2014, was it? 2014 or 2015, I was pretty much in court, in a different courtroom for every day of the whole year, I reckon, for my whole reporting year, doing the Morecambe trial and the Baden Clay trial and a few royal commissions. And I really like it because it's almost like theatre, because you sit in the public gallery of a courtroom and you watch the theatre of the legal system unfold in front of your eyes, and your job is to... Sometimes you can be sitting there for a whole day of evidence, and potentially only 5 minutes in the heart of it sums up the whole day or is the crucial part. I think I like watching the drama. I like watching the drama unfold in front of you, and also it's really fun. I don't know if it sounds strange to say, because I've just talked about 2 murder trials and royal commissions about things that aren't particularly cheery, but there's great camaraderie among court reporters, which we also see in the parliamentary press gallery, and there's also the challenge of, often you're sitting with your colleagues or your competitors, you're all watching the same thing, so there's a writing challenge as well in it. I think you've got to try and make your story the most beautifully written, perfectly accurate account of what has happened there. So often it would be, you open up the papers the next day and compare did I get the best line? Did they get the best line? And the other challenge of court reporting is everything that doesn't happen in the courtroom. There's an enormous trove of potential stories that get filed in the courts in terms of lawsuits, in terms of legal contacts that you make who can point you in the right direction. So that's where you might be covering the same stories as everybody else, but the other challenge of court reporting is being able to dig through information that other people may not know about and find exclusives, I suppose, or find stories that other people haven't got to yet. So yeah, it's just great. It's great fun.
It takes patience to sit through a full day of court proceedings. Is it just engaging in itself, or do you have ways of making sure that you're paying attention to every word that's being said?
Some of my colleagues will do the crossword. Sometimes if you have to wait, you often have to wait for your matter to be on, or if you're just sitting through legal argument that you can't report, you maybe you will look at Twitter or something, or some people do the crossword. But yeah, it is a chat. Like it's so often an endurance test of your attention span, because if you miss the key moment, there's no getting it back.
Yeah, you can't rewind.
Yeah, you can't go, oh, sorry, Your Honour, what just happened there? I mean, you can ask the person next to you, and people are very nice and normally will tell you, but that's a high risk thing, because the other thing about court reporting is it's high risk, because if you do the wrong thing, if you're inaccurate, if you report something that you're not allowed to report, it can have huge consequences. Like, you can abort a trial, you can get charged with contempt. So there are really strict rules about what you can and can't report. So that's the other sort of high stakes part of it. I know one trial that I did was about the Lacey brothers, who are from the Gold Coast, and one was a wannabe rapper and the other one was a wannabe pro skateboarder, but they were like gangsters, sort of wannabe. They were actual gangsters in their spare time, and they'd hired a Melbourne barrister called Robert Richter, who you might recognise the name because he's now representing George Pell. And so every morning you come into the courtroom and look at the bar table, so where the barristers stand, and see if they had any newspapers on the bar table, and then you would think, oh my god, before the jury comes in, they're going to pick up this newspaper and they're going to say to the judge, this is outrageous. This is, yeah. So that hasn't happened. That didn't happen to me in that trial. It did happen in the Morecambe trial, and there's nothing more. There's few things more terrifying than having your story discussed in court in a not very favourable way. Yeah.
You've been Queensland political reporter at the paper since September 2015. During that time in particular, I think Clive Palmer has featured heavily in your reporting. What's your relationship with Clive like? And maybe give some context for people who aren't from Queensland, who may not have followed this as closely as you have. Why has he been in the news for the last couple of years?
Well, Clive Palmer was originally a colourful businessman who was known for sort of outlandish outlandish schemes. Like he owned the Sunshine Coast Coolum Resort, and a nickel refinery in Townsville, had some mining interests in Western Australia and in the Galilee Basin. So he was sort of from a history of colourful Queensland business identities, I suppose, before he entered Parliament as the federal member for Fairfax. When I started covering him was late 2015, when his nickel refinery in Townsville started to run into financial troubles. His whole corporate empire started to run into financial troubles, and he had to start asking governments for handouts to keep the refinery open. So that was the first time I'd done any concerted reporting on Clive, although everybody in Queensland who's in the media has done at least one Clive Palmer press conference or at least one story about Palmer, because he is very loves being in the media, and for a long time journalists loved reporting on him, on his antics. But yeah, things took a more serious turn when in January 2016 the refinery company, Queensland Nickel, was put into voluntary administration. So around that time, and a whole heap of employees were made redundant. So at around that time, I guess I did some concerted reporting. It was one good thing about working over the Christmas period. was there's hardly any other reporters in the office. So I got to do the big story, I suppose. And I also had more time to investigate what was going on. So I'd met some really good contacts in Townsville when I'd been up to report the story late the previous year, and was sort of kept being fed information from Townsville, and then also other people who I won't name, obviously, pointing me in the right direction at certain things that I should be looking at. And once it fell into voluntary administration, then the challenge was to do some, I guess, financial reporting, looking at doing company searches of Queensland Nickel, looking at the directors, looking at what had happened immediately before it was put into voluntary administration. For instance, I found out that Clive had 2 of his other companies become secured creditors of Queensland Nickel just, 5 days before it collapsed, which meant that put those companies ahead of other creditors in the quest for getting money out of Queensland Nickel. A colleague and I, another colleague who worked at the paper, Jessica Grewal, she was interviewing some of the ex-workers, and someone said in an offhand remark something like, "Oh, I bet Terry Smith signed off on that," or something. And she came over and told me after that, they said Terry Smith. And I was like, "Who's Terry Smith?" So I started to ask everybody that I spoke to, what about this Terry Smith? And it emerged that was Clive Palmer's alias. So he had said that once he'd entered federal politics, he was retired from business, and he had nothing to do with the day-to-day running of the refinery. But I found out that his email address was in the name of Terry Smith, that he signed off on expenditure for the refinery in his name of Terry Smith. I managed to encourage a few different people to provide me with documents that showed that he was using the email address Terry Smith and signing off, "Thanks, Clive."
Thanks, Clive Palmer.
Yeah, exactly.
His full name. Yeah.
Yeah. So that, I think that was like one of the interesting things. Obviously, Clive's head sort of exploded at that. He initially tried to deny it. Then when he realised he couldn't deny it, he admitted it. And now that the company's gone into liquidation and we're in the public examination mode and it's all being fought out through the courts, a lot of those stories have been confirmed on the public record, I guess. In the public examinations in the federal court, he's confirmed on the record that he's Terry Smith. And Clive is like a very genial character. He doesn't answer my phone calls anymore. He occasionally answers my phone calls. I mostly text him. A fellow journalist said that the key to get him to answer your text is to put emojis in them. So ever since that, I now put emojis, and I have varying degrees of success. I texted him the other day when this most recent lawsuit was lodged, because I had to text him because he's on a cruise in the Mediterranean, and he texted back, saying that the lawsuit was a political witch hunt and blah, blah, blah. I think he enjoys the sparring. I don't think he likes what's being reported about him, because I think he likes to be loved. But it's an important story to do, and I think his overriding feeling is that he likes being in the news. I mean, you've seen what he puts on Twitter. He just loves being the center of attention, and I think his aim with that Twitter account and the turn that it's taken, the weird poetry and the memes, is to rehabilitate his image, sort of, to be a figure of fun again, rather than it's sort of like a distraction to make people stop thinking about the fact that Queensland Nickel collapsed owing $300 million in debts, 800 people lost their jobs. You and I, as federal taxpayers, spent $70 million covering the redundancy entitlements of his workers, entitlements that company didn't pay. So I think that the theatre of Clive's Twitter it may seem silly, but I think he's very clever. Like, he's so clever in manipulating the media and manipulating public opinion about himself.
You won several awards at the Queensland Clarion Awards last year, including Queensland Journalist of the Year.
It's been a very slow year for everybody else.
Do not be modest. You're not allowed to be modest. I wondered whether you got a message of congratulations from Clive.
No, I didn't. I did have some messages from, not from Clive himself, but from some people who work closely with him, though. Some people who are still allies of Clive who congratulated me. So that was nice, but nothing from Clive himself, sadly.
Well, you're still Journalist of the Year for at least another month or so, a couple of months, so there's still time. Clive, if you're listening to this. I'm joking, of course. I'm wondering whether that title, you are the current Queensland Journalist of the Year, do you use that to your advantage in press conferences or emails? So introducing yourself.
No!
Dear source, my name is Sarah Elks, reporter at The Australian and current Queensland Journalist of the Year.
Oh my God, no, that is the most mortifying thing. No, I have never ever introduced myself that way. People in my workplace tease me about it, but no. It was like a lovely thing to happen to me, and I really didn't expect it. But no, I have never introduced myself that way. I'm embarrassed at the thought.
I know you are. I'm sorry. But you're a very well-deserved winner, so...
You're very kind. We should also point out, listeners, that Andrew has won the Freelance Journalist of the Year at the Clarions for the last two, and he'd be my pick for the third time, the trifecta this year.
Well, thank you very much. Coming towards the end, you conducted an investigation into the Agriculture Minister for Queensland late last year with a colleague of yours. Could you talk about that for a little bit? And that's a fairly significant display of reporting, uncovering something and having a massive effect.
Yeah. So Sarah Vogler, who's a very talented journalist who worked at The Australian for too short a time, now she's back at the Courier Mail, where she's the state political editor. She and I won't give away too many details, but about where we were together and we got a tip about Leanne Donaldson, who was the Agriculture Minister in the Palaszczuk government at the time.
And a member for Bundaberg.
And yes, the member for Bundaberg.
My hometown.
Oh, really? Oh, well, there you go. Yes, she quite unexpectedly won that seat at the last election. That was a big swing.
Against Jack Dempsey.
Against Jack Dempsey, who's now the mayor of Bundaberg. And I think people were quite surprised that she had won. So she's on quite a narrow margin in Bundaberg, and the tip was that she wasn't very good with her finances and that maybe she owed some rates. So we set about proving that. We discovered that, unbeknownst, I didn't know this beforehand, but there's one of the company searches or one of the corporate searches that you can do on a database that we have access to is through each council you can search unpaid rates. So we had to try and find out what her home address was, which we did through an RP data search. Once you find the home address, then you pay for a search through the council to say the owner of this home, how many, are there any outstanding rates? That took several weeks to go through the system. In the meantime, I did a courts record search, which is something that I do often if I'm looking at somebody in the civil courts to find out if they've ever been sued for anything in Queensland, and it came up that she had been involved in a lawsuit, so I had to apply for those documents, go into the courts, or that she'd been behind in her mortgage repayments before she'd been pre-selected and before she'd been elected. And also she hadn't declared her mortgage on her pecuniary interests register. And then we got the council search back, which confirmed that she had like $8,000 worth of rates owing, which may not seem like much, but that's more than 3 years worth. And this was a minister who at the time was earning $320,000 or something like that a year, and managing a department with a really big budget. So you would kind of hope that the people who are in those positions are keeping up with their bills, as you know, we all are expected to do. And yeah, once we got all that information together, we decided that we were going to run the story the next day. So Sarah and I contacted the Premier's office, we contacted the Minister's office, and very quickly things all sort of started to happen. She arranged for the Labor Party State Secretary to pay her bill, the rates bill, to stop her house being sold by the council. She updated her pecuniary interest register. What else? She had to do a statement to Parliament, which she did late at night, and then the story came out in the paper. The next day it was on the front page of the Oz, and by like 10 p.m. that night she was standing up in Parliament resigning from the cabinet. So it was quite an unexpected thing, because, I mean, to her credit, she resigned from the cabinet. We've seen a lot of instances where ministers have held on for dear life through scandal after scandal, and I suppose she decided that it was going to be too damaging for the government and fell on her sword. She's still an MP. She's still the member for Bundaberg, your hometown, up until the next election, when I guess there's talk that she will have trouble holding on to that seat just because it's on such a fine margin, but we'll wait and see.
Mm-hmm. Do you enjoy that process of search and discovery of that kind of thing, about, I don't know, financial impropriety, whatever the word is?
Yeah, I do. It can be fruitless sometimes. Most of the time it's fruitless. But when you do find something, it is quite satisfying, because often it's something that a person in a position of power, or a person in the public eye, doesn't want you to know about. I mean, obviously certain things are private and shouldn't be in the public domain, but I think, like in the case of Clive Palmer and his financial dealings, or Leanne Donaldson and her, even though they're her personal finances, I think that they are in the public interest, and I think in those cases they do deserve to be uncovered.
It's the role of journalism, isn't it, to keep power to account?
Yes, it is, and I think that that's an important thing that we need to do. And coming back to what your question was at the start, is how much is reactive and how much is proactive reporting. I think governments try to get you to do as much reactive reporting as possible, as in they try and do as many shiny announcements and as many, hey, look over here, we're doing this type thing, to, obviously they've got to announce the good work that they're doing, they've got to talk about what's actually going on, but often the more important story is what people don't want you to know. And so I think the challenge for me and the challenge for other journalists in this day and age is to try and carve out a little bit of time in our busy schedules to see if you can dig around and find out things that people don't want you to know. The
judge's comments on Sarah's award for Queensland Journalist of the Year read, Her work is a tremendous how-to for journalists, young and old, and deserves recognition. I concur. Thank you for joining me, Sarah.
Thank you. Cue the theme song.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thank you to my guest, Sarah Elks. You can find show notes to this episode and all previous episodes at penmanshippodcast.com. If you have feedback, I would love to hear from you. Andrew@penmanshippodcast.com is my email. You can also find the show on Twitter, @penmanshipau, and on Facebook. If you enjoy this podcast, there are a couple of ways you can support it. You can leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or wherever you happen to be listening to this podcast. Or you can tell people about it. You can share it with people in your life who love reading and talking about great Australian writing. The theme song is Eternally Yours by Laughing Clowns. That's it for now. Until next time.